So the real issue here when we're talking about protectionism is back to this original assumption that globalization equals economic growth and cooperation, and therefore any efforts to undermine that are challenging the very idea of free trade. So let's talk a little bit about what free trade is before we get into protectionism and comparative advantage.
Throughout the 2016 election, candidates Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have had clearly divided and opposing views, but one topic on which they share their opposition is that of free trade agreements. Many people have demonized free trade agreements like NAFTA and the TPP in the last year. So what exactly are these agreements and what is so bad about them? Well, first, it's important to realize that the world economy, and by extension standards of living, are dependent on international trade. In practice, countries which produce more usually do better economically, and many countries enact trade rules which favor their own production. For example, in the 1920s, European farms were able to sell agricultural goods to the United States very cheaply. This undercut American farmers, and so Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which raised taxes on imports. This artificially made foreign goods very expensive compared to domestic goods, now favoring the American farmer. Laws and rules like these are called protectionist. Free trade agreements are, at their most basic, a series of compromises between countries. They remove protectionist restrictions and taxes, but also work to keep participating economies from falling apart without them. Most countries are members of the World Trade Organization, which regulates international trade agreements and maintains the global economy. But one of the problems with free trade agreements is that they can also hurt consumers. For example, in 2011, tobacco giant Philip Morris sued the country of Australia for implementing anti-smoking regulations. The company argued that the regulations would violate a portion of a 1993 trade agreement between Hong Kong and Australia because plain packaging would diminish their trademark. And even though the lawsuit failed to stop restrictions, it is an example of free trade agreement overreach. A much more common complaint, especially in the US, is that free trade agreements lead to outsourcing and a loss of American jobs. When the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was established between the US and Canada and Mexico in 1994, it eliminated most taxes on imports and exports between those countries. This made it cheaper to import food and goods from Mexico than it was to grow or make them in the United States. This led to considerably cheaper goods and a net benefit for consumers. However, the trade agreement also led to outsourcing those same farming and manufacturing jobs to Mexico. It's been estimated that 1 million jobs have been lost to NAFTA over the past 2 decades. In short, a free trade agreement makes it easier for foreign countries to compete with local production, making everything less expensive according to free market principles. But for those workers who actually have to compete with cheaper foreign labor or resources, they're often forced to find new work. There are also a huge number of other considerations besides actual trade that go into free trade agreements, like environmental and copyright concerns. In the end, free trade agreements can make goods cheaper and more available. However, this benefit can come at the expense of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. The TPP is one such...
The premise of growing is also being challenged by environmental reasons, right? So why do we continue with this? Why do we continue with this assumption? Well, the underlying assumption is that if you have a relative advantage in one area over other areas, why not shift your production to that area that you're best at, right? So it's an assumption that free trade is efficient. It also assumes that goods aren't necessary for like your day-to-day life. So you don't export all of your clean water and don't have any left over. That currencies don't impact these advantages, which is more complicated and not the case. And that being freer always promotes efficiency. But efficiency, again, is normally seen in terms of a market, and the market's efficient measure is price. So as we saw in the video, that which costs the less is assumed to be the most efficient, even if it comes with the negative externalities of pollution, lower labor laws, lower wages, all of those problems that come with it. And so the problem of basing it on a market principle or a price is that price doesn't always cost in things such as, Facebook's market share grows, but it degrades the quality of democracy and makes everything worse for everybody, right? Questions like that. And so we've always got these issues of when trade fails, we go back to protectionism. And so that's how Trump framed all of his protectionist assertions, is that we are responding to threats or failures from the outside. And so we've seen this before the interwar period. And we see this, I'll show clips in a minute, both in Greece and Iceland and how they responded to the 2008 financial crisis. They respond quite differently based on their vision of the problem. If you see it as the market just working itself out, then you don't feel the need to intervene, even when there's massive unemployment. But massive unemployment causes social unrest, and if social unrest gets you kicked out of office, you have to do something. And so more often than not, you'll try to do things like stimulate growth, like buy American or buy Canadian clauses that encourage people to buy domestically. But if you put too many restrictions on it, then under NAFTA, Canada fought the buy American that Obama tried to do after 2008. And so this perception that capitalism is the end goal of all human existence, or that liberal democracy is the best way we can conceive of the world, I'm still not, this was my dissertation, I'm still not convinced there is one capitalism. I'm not convinced that it doesn't reflect different attitudes and values, and that the thing that money that transfers across boundaries doesn't fundamentally alter those boundaries and then alter those societies. I like to use the example of, like, anytime you cheat at a video game and you bring in some outside money that's not supposed to be there, it just totally just screws up your markets. And so you have to find a good balance between growth and social benefit. And too often we think growth is social benefit, and that's just too simple. The main reason is that we have seen growth, but without some corrective measures to stop the trickle-down economics, which is fundamentally a regressive system. So it was a progressive system at the end of World War II. Highest marginal tax rate was 92%. And now we're at record lows in terms of tax rate, which means that at a certain point in time, society said that the richest people in society have to, for every dollar they make, they have to put 92 cents back into the society. That's what a liberal society does, right? Otherwise, you're in a feudal society or some type of oligarchical society where the rich just get richer no matter what they do. And so the idea of having a progressive taxation system is that redistribution happens. Now, if you change that system, which we've done since 1950 to the present, you change the redistribution of resources in that society. And it's not passive. It's not just that one group gets it, another one doesn't. It actually alters over time. And so neoliberalism coincides quite dramatically and directly with the decline in unionization. It's constantly demonized as the source of all problems, but over and over again, big meta studies from the World Bank and the IMF and places like that show the direct correlation with income inequality. And it's pretty simple, right? Your employer can't force you to take less money if you have restrictions in place that stop them from firing you and paying you less. And so this becomes the real target of protectionism. To what extent are trade unions an impediment to free trade? But that's because they're trying to establish social values. So I'll show these two clips. Actually, I'll show this, and then I'll go back to the clip. So, for example, both Iceland and Greece are smaller examples, but they're useful because of the way they frame this. If you want to look at, for example, union density, its peak. So if you look at the peak here, it's 1950, 1960. This is from the Left Business Observer. It's Doug Henwood's. He does good data analysis out of the States. He's very left, but his data is good. And so it just shows the total union density over time, and it strongly correlates to income distribution. And so if you show if you want to see how different groups in society can ask for and get more resources, you just have to look at the extent to which they're unionized, and then you can see the difference in their pay. And so if you look at union density by state, you can also look at which states have the ability to have more equitable distribution and unequitable distribution. So this is the pretty basic stuff. As union membership falls, income concentrates at the top, and so we see from 1917 this increasing union membership, where we have a progressive system around the 1940s, and since then we have a regressive system where union membership goes down and income share goes up. This is just entitlements. How do you demand entitlements? You can demand entitlements in terms of wages, or you can demand them in terms of racism or whatever else you want. But it's just your capacity to politically mobilize to insist that the state, which is capable of doing it, either enforces or doesn't enforce tax, right? This isn't very simple. So back to the issue of the crisis here, we'll just have two different visions on how to respond to these crises. And so Iceland's is very different than Greece's.
traditional crisis countries, with unusual among traditional
Iceland
crisis
was
countries.
unusual.
With IMF programs, they did not have the kind of austerity that so often pushes an economy down. Well, I think it got right that it was more transparent, that it was more engaged with citizens than it was in other countries. I think it got right that it was less contractionary than it was in other countries. It was more supportive of capital controls. It allowed the government to set its own framework. It was very supportive of this restructuring. So I think all of those were movements in the right direction.
So instead of undergoing
The
austerity,
direction which Iceland did, which having the shareholders and the bondholders be accountable, is absolutely essential, I think, going forward. I don't think that the problems are necessarily over yet. The debts are still in the process of being restructured. 2 of the major banks are foreign-owned. The financial sector in every country is often misaligned with the interest of the country itself. And that's even more so when there's often foreign ownership.
so in this case, the crisis was largely framed as an external shock. So they imposed capital controls. They weren't willing to undergo austerity. Austerity is when you contract the government to pay back your debt. And they were willing to default on some of their obligations and take the punishment of that rather than say, we are going to pay this back through taxation. Now, it's a very small, Iceland's like hundreds of thousands of people. It's not big. But they took a different approach than that of
And
Greece.
finally, there is this legal issue that's hanging over the country of what will happen to the iSaver accounts. I think, from my own point of view, what Iceland did was right. It would have been wrong to burden future generations with the mistakes of the financial system and the failure in UK or Netherlands to adequately regulate. And I think we've learned one of the lessons for Europe is that the single market principle needs to be questioned.
So Iceland's recovery has been a bit better. Now, this is Greece. I found this on TikTok the other day, and I thought it was an interesting contrast to that. So Greece has been in one of the longest depressions since 2008 because it did undergo austerity, and it continued to stay in the EU. I don't even read that. So, anyways, let's see if I can fix that on the fly. I'm not sure if I can. But so the idea here is that in Greece, in order to stay in the euro, they've undertaken such a massive contraction of their economy. It's no longer seen as a kind of positive outcome or something that was beneficial for them. It was seen as much more that it made more sense for them to revalue, or they should have revalued in terms of things that were beneficial to them as a society rather than that was beneficial to those who got them into the problem in the first place. Here, let's try that again. Longest recovery. So it's the idea here they lost control. So they didn't have those protectionist measures. This is TikTok thinking what it is. It's an argument. You don't have to take all of its data. But the debt is there. They don't have an adequate way to pay it back, so it just kind of sits there as a kind of weight on the economy. It's about the analysis you'd expect from a TikTok. But the idea here is that protectionism kind of comes organically from demands. Either those demands are going to be made somewhere. And if you can frame it in terms of, well, we've got too much debt and everybody has to pay for it, that's different than if you can frame it in terms of, this is a couple of elites problem. Let's contract from the global economy, fix ourselves, and then come back in.